Hi, this is your instructional video over factoring with polynomials, day 2, or part B. The objective is to apply various operations to polynomials, and the essential question is, how do I find the factors of a polynomial? So let's take a look at why we have to learn how to factor. We learned to factor a polynomial because it actually shows us where the solution is. So let's write that down. And we're looking specifically for a solution that is on a graph. So let's look at what this really means. Let's look at example 1. In example 1, it says factor y equals x squared plus 4x minus 5. Well, now you notice, since this is day 2, we're adding something a little bit more to the problem. We're adding a y equals. The reason why we do that is because this polynomial is actually a picture. We have it right here at the bottom right corner of your notes. So when we look at x squared plus 4x minus 5, this is a polynomial that can be graphed, and this is what it looks like. This is called a quadratic, and we'll go more into detail later on in this chapter. So the first thing I want to do is remember back how to factor. So remember, like how we learned to multiply, we drew our sideways L. Now we're going to go backwards. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make our rectangle and split it into 2 by 2. Now we're going to look at the 1x squared plus 4x minus 5. Remember, the 1x squared goes at the top left, the minus 5 goes at the bottom right. So in class, we talked about how do we find the factors. We're going to multiply 1 times negative 5, and your teacher should have taught you how to put this in the calculator or to find the factors by hand. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the factors of negative 5. Well, it's 1 and 5. So now I have two numbers, which I know I need to put it here in my diagonals. So let's now figure out what my signs have to be. Well, I have a positive 1 and a positive 5 right now. I need to add them up so I get a positive 4. So that means the 1 has to be a negative. So now I'm going to put my negative 1x at the top right and my 5x at the bottom left. Again, you could have flip-flopped these two and that would have been totally fine. Alright, so now let's take a look and see what the two rows have in common. So I'm going to use blue to go side by side. What do both of these have in common? Or what is my GCF? They both have a 1 and an x. So let's look at the bottom row. What do both of these have in common? Let's look at the 5. They both have 5s. So let's look at the signs in just a little bit when we double check. Now I'm going to use red to go up and down. Let's look at the left column. What do both of these have in common? That's right, they both have a 1x. Let's look at the second column. Let's see what both of these have in common. Well, notice that these both have a negative sign, so I can go ahead and take the negative sign out as my GCF. And since I have 1 and 5, they only share the number 1. So now let's double check to make sure that my signs are correct. So let's go back and check. So 1 times 1 is 1, and x times x does give me 1x squared. So top left box is correct. Let's look at the top right and double check. 1 times negative 1 is negative 1, and I do have my x. Let's look at the bottom row. 1 times 5 is 5, and I bring my x. And then bottom right, negative 1 times 5 is negative 5. So that is correct. So my factors are 1x minus 1 and 1x plus 5. Now, if you wanted to write the recessive side first, that would have been fine too. Both of these answers are correct. Now let's take a look at why we just factored. If you look at our factor, this is what we got as our answer. Now look at the picture here. So when you look at your picture, something should go off in your head regarding this 5 inside the parentheses and where it crosses the x-axis, and the 1 that's inside of the parentheses and the picture where it crosses the x-axis again. Notice that there is a connection between these two answers. So this is why we learned to factor. This inside will create a solution once we actually get to that point, and that will be later on in the chapter. So let's take a look at example 2 and let's factor again. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create my Punnett square box. So I'm going to draw my left T. Now I'm going to fill in my boxes. So here at the top left, it's going to be a negative 1x squared, and the bottom right will be a negative 12. Now I'm going to multiply these two for you, and it's going to be a positive 12. Now your teacher should have told you how to find the factors in class. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you what the factors are. Alright, so here are the factors that you can find in the graphing calculator. Now, I know that when I add them together, I should get a negative 8. So that means I'm going to need to use 2 and 6. But what about my signs? Since I want a negative 8, I'm going to go ahead and make both of them negatives. So this is where I'm going to put a negative 2x at the top right and the negative 6x at the bottom left. So now I'm going to find my factors. Now, my factors are going to be, take a look at the top row. What do they both have in common? Well, they both have a negative 1 and they both have x's. So I'm going to factor out a negative 1x. Let's look at the second row. What do they both have in common? They both also have negatives, and 6 can go into both of those. So now let's look at the first column. Let's go up and down. What do both of these have in common? Well, both of these have negatives in common, but I'm going to go ahead and leave that negative out because if you look at your answer here and you go backwards, I need one of these factors to be a positive and one to be negative so that I get a negative 1x squared on the inside. So that's why this one is going to stay positive. Let's look at the second column. The second column, what do they both have? That's right, they also both have a negative, but since I already have a negative here on my recessive side, I'm going to take just the positive 2 out of this first column, or the right column. So now let's double check to make sure my signs are correct. So let's take a look. Positive 1 times negative 1 is indeed negative 1, so I get x squared. So top left box is correct. I'm going to put a little check mark to make sure that I double check myself. Let's double check the top right. Negative 1 times 2 is negative 2x. So I know that's correct. So I'm going to put a little check. Let's check the bottom left. Positive 1 times negative 6 is negative 6. So that's going to be correct. And I get negative 6x because I bring the x over here. And bottom right, let's double check. Negative 6 times 2 is negative 12. So that's also correct. So now I know my signs are correct. So now I'm ready to find the factors. Now, if you look at the original problem, we used the letter f of x. Now, don't panic because you see the f of x. This is just a simple way of writing y equals. Also, we write it like this because eventually we're going to graph it in the calculator. So we're looking for a function of the letter x. So now my factors are my recessive side here, negative 1x minus 6, and my dominant side here, positive 1x plus 2. So this is the answer to my problem of when I factor. The problem, f of x equals negative x squared minus 8x minus 12. Alright, example 3, 4, and 5 will be done in class. Feel free to try example 3 out on your own. Good luck!